Thank you so much, Roshi. And hello, community. Hello, kin folks. um, just a bow of gratitude to um, the potency and prayer of this offering, this platform for us to come together and explore with tremendous tenderness and focus how we gather, how we organize ourselves in our hearts and in our minds to be of service to the world. I have a lot I want to say to you today. I don't, I don't say these things easily. Like, I'm aware of the swell in my heart and the trepidation of trying to talk about what matters most. And I have a feeling I'm joining so many of you in a quaking of heart as we look at the challenges that we face in the world right now, especially in the States. And it really is a challenge to some degree of belonging and of understanding what it means to belong in a very deep and intimate way through the lens of our vows, through the lens of our practice, as Roshi is sharing. So the way I want to kind of enter this is to say that racism is a heart disease and it's curable. And so I want to just kind of explore what I mean by that and what that has to do with you. One way to begin to look at it, and I know many of you have looked at it in a variety of ways, is to look at the teaching on ultimate and relative reality that we have so profoundly, so fundamentally in the Buddhist teaching. So in ultimate reality, and I'm being very simplistic with this teaching, which is very deep, but I'm being very simplistic with it. In ultimate reality, we're unconditioned, right? We are nobodies. There's this emptiness of solidarity in this immeasurable way that we are in the world. In relative reality, we are conditioned. We are in these bodies. We are formed and we are habituated through our, egos and concepts that that helps us navigate our day-to-day movement. In this relative sense, I'm African American, I'm lesbian, I'm elder, I'm a great grandmother, I'm an artist, and I'm a whole lot of names people have attributed to me. But of course, in ultimate reality, I'm none of these things. I'm beyond concept, right? A constant and countless stream of existence. And in relative reality, in this sense, this flip sense that I'm playing with it, there is racial ignorance, there's injury, there's injustice. And ultimate reality, there's no such thing as race, right? So we're playing with how we navigate this relative reality that we're actually in co-creation with. All of us are. T.S. Eliot tells us that the eternal is outside of time, yet it is only in time that the fruits of spiritual liberation can manifest. So these two expressions is really of one truth, but we don't get to really understand this ultimate sense outside of these bodies, outside of our conditioning, in this relative sense of race and gender and class, etc. We need all of these conditionings in order to wake up to how we are in service in a very intimate and belonging way. So as I talk to you, I'm speaking to you from this context of our relative, of our relational, of how we've constructed and been in co-creation relationally and how that collectively serves or not. I'm going to be speaking mostly to kind of a U.S. construct, but the shape of racial oppression and dominance can be seen. Once we get a sense of the shape of it, we can see it in a lot of different geographies on this earth. I'm going to be using gross labels like white folks and BIPOC folks in order to help us understand this kind of relative construction of ourselves and habits of mind and our conditioning that we've been in. It's not to put us in a box, but it's to understand that we're in a box that can be useful in serving how we get out of it. In the work that I do, racism, in my mind, remains one of the most rooted and painful impasses of our time, and is fed through unawareness, the misuse of power, and I'm talking about our inability to bear witness to the painful truth of how things are, of how we've been conditioned intimately, how we are a part of actually what's happening. The current racial injury and injustice that's pervasive in our social fabric and throughout the world, our planet and our communities and our families, in our own hearts, is a result of actions and seeds that were planted in the past. And what we do today is also seeds that are planted. So we have to ask ourselves, why are matters of race still matters of concern? And what does this have to do with me, with my heart and mind, with my service? We can begin by asking, how would you define the profile of dominance, let's just say within the United States? You can add that to the chat. When you think of dominance and the profile of that, what do you see when you look at the United States? Let me see what you put in the chat. Where is the chat? All right, white men. Ooh, it's moving fast. Oh, white men, dominance. Ooh, bullies, rich, capitalist. Yes, yes, yes. So hungry, privilege, oligarchy. Well, we know this can go on and on, right? So we could see this, the list continues. It will be part of the recording, so we can all take a look at just what we see here, which is important to understand. But I want to talk about racial dominance and subordination and just the dance of this. In my work, I usually speak to 6 hindrances to racial harmony. But what I want to mostly focus on today are the hindrances of white privilege and white supremacy. And it's really looking at our conditioning, our sankharas, our patterns, our tattoos, our habits of mind that are at play, whether they're conscious or not. We all have racial identities, and we're all membered in a racial group identity. And some of us are in more complex racial identity groups. Characteristic of being in these groups is BIPOC folks, for the most part, tend to be readily identified with their racial group identity. Because a lot of times, being membered collectively in this way, our lives kind of depends on it. Whereas white folks can readily identify as being individuals, unaware of being membered in whiteness. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a little bit. When I say unaware of whiteness, what I mean is that the engagement with other white people has not occurred broadly. White people coming together to talk about whiteness has not been as engaged as, let's just say, BIPOC people coming together to talk about the impact of whiteness in their lives. And our challenge is to understand both of these things. Our individual conditioning as well as our conditioning at a group level within our racial group membership. There are some characteristics that we can begin to notice, and I know a number of you are activists, you're out there, protesting and doing any number of things to kind of interrupt the structural harm that is pervasive. And there's some things that we can begin to recognize. Because here's one of the things I worry about. I worry about us doing the work of social activism without intimately connecting to how it has affected us at the racial group level. I want it to be, I want activism to be more felt in our bones, not as a thing that's out there, but as a thing we're actually membered in. So these are some of the characteristics that are socially, you might say, observable in terms of dominance, white dominance, and subordinated BIPOC groups. For white folks, some of the characteristics we can see under the umbrella of dominance is that as a group, white folks define the social norms, control the resources. There is a social presumption of superiority. There's a tendency toward fixing the problem more than there is the experience of understanding the roots of the problem. Many white folks collectively do not notice or understand subordinated racial group experiences. White body folks are individually focused, individually identity focused, unaware often of being a racial group with impinging impact on other races. And the common belief system that operates without examination can convince me that this is a problem, make me see, help me understand, and then I'll decide. BIPOC folks, socially subordinated and within this dominant system, tends to react or assimilate to the social norms, fight for resources. They understand that there's a social presumption of inferiority, wants racial problems to be acknowledged, felt, and understood so that they can be more deeply uprooted. Notice and understand dominant racial group power as their lives depend on understanding that. Many BIPOC folks identify readily with being a group as opposed to being individuals. And they're aware of the racial group that is impinging upon their racial identity, either through exploitation or oppression. And the common mindset is two, actually. You won't get away with this, and damn it, you got away with it. And this sense of despair. So many white people that I work with don't readily identify with white privilege because they don't feel at the individual level that they're being privileged, right? But the way to understand privilege and white supremacy is to understand group identity and power systems. So you're looking at the patterns of what's happening, not just the individual acts. So white supremacy and systemic racism is a roll-up. What we see in these power structures is a roll-up of the white identity group not being vetted. So the consciousness, beliefs, habits get rolled up into power structures that then get proliferated as the norm. And it's often an unconscious dynamic. And you see it played because there are sometimes belief systems where, well, I did it, everybody should be able to do it. I pulled myself up by my bootstraps, blah, blah, blah. But what we have to understand is that many of the institutions that we see were not created with BIPOC folks in mind. This is kind of one of the reasons diversity, equity, and inclusion became an influx into some of these systems, or appendaged into some of these systems, because there is not a consciousness of BIPOC understanding. It wasn't created with that, so that has to be built in, and this really takes a lot of consciousness and intention to make that happen. So cultures of racism, whether innocence or ignorance, are pervasive and generative and commonly unrecognized by white folks because of a lack of understanding of that group identity, of a dissecting and understanding and engagement around whiteness. And because power feels good, and most people who have it feel deserving of it. Now, Martin Luther King Jr. said in his eulogy of the Ku Klux Klan bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church, he said, "We must be concerned not merely about who murdered them, but also the systems, the way of life, the philosophy which produced the murderers." So we want to look at systems and the consciousness of systems, and also our membership in it, right? So what do we see today, especially in, in our kind of U.S. kind of political system, if you will, today? I know you see it as well as I do. There's autocracy. There's this kind of dismantling of democracy right before our eyes. This sense of the rule of law from one ruling class, and this half of the 1% that holds all the wealth in this country. We see the imprints of fascism, the aggressive movement towards white nationalist consolidation, the presumption of superiority, this sense that everyone else is not smart enough, not deserving, the belief that we've gotten too far away from ourselves in this country. There's dominance, there's deregulation, consolidation of power above the law, ideology, control over the media, military, education, prison industrial complex. A lot of what Naomi Klein calls in the Truth Doctrine disaster capitalist. We're moving in a direction of isolationism, the reduction in alliances with democracies, NATO, global war alienation. There's this anti-woke culture, the book bans, media suppression, DEI suppression, women and girls' rights and trans rights and immigrant rights and so on. It's the disrespect of our larger body of color, which is the earth herself. The seizure of land and boundaries and the constant threat of deportation and threats on our economy. And there's also just massive incompetence, greed, ill will, and delusion. Much harm is being done at this time. These are seeds being planted that must be uprooted. Now, white privilege and white supremacy are maintained through collusion. Collusion is this nuanced way whites maintain membership in an unacknowledged group identity and whiteness to gain favor or approval, to maintain superiority or privilege, to play it safe, fit in, avoid being a target, or to be different. Collusion influences who's in, who's out, and who's reassured. And there's like 3 ways that this is commonly expressed. It's expressed through blindness, sameness, and silence. The blindness is sense of delusion, not seeing, the sense of alternative facts. Well, that's just not the way to look at it. Kind of a dismissal, this notion of fake news when the elephant is right in the room. Sameness, you look around and everybody looks like us. I remember back, this is like a long time ago, but I saw something that said, read something like incoming Congress, 80% white male, 92% Christian, 100% that this is not a problem. That kind of notion of how sameness can play, and again, in its innocence and ignorance. And silence, a sense of speechless, avoidance of honesty and directness, silence as violence. We can see how silence is playing in the political realm of not going against what's being said. And a lot of white folks I've seen in some of the work that I do won't even discuss race unless a BIPOC person brings it up. And then the discussion centers around what do the BIPOC folks need, or what mistake have I made, as opposed to maybe looking at how silence has kind of forced a different narrative other than that kind of underpinning discomfort that we feel when we're in silence, when we're not taking a stance to say what might need to be said. When collusion is pervasive, white people are sheltered from racial intimacy, racial literacy, and an understanding of the impact of whiteness on other races. So one of the areas that I feel has been broadly neglected in this scope of social justice, if you will, has been white people coming together to talk about whiteness with each other. There's been some amazing coming together to do social activist work out there to make, it's just a lot happening around protest, and all of that needs to still happen. I'm not saying it doesn't. But there's a piece where white people begin to deconstruct the collective norms of whiteness that hasn't been deeply investigated at the group level. See, there's no shortage of information about how racism is out there. There's tons of information. It's been out there forever. What's missing is a lot of things, but what's missing a lot and deeply is white folks understanding at an intimate level what whiteness means and how it impacts in the world. And because white folks are in power, that becomes even more important to understand. Not just understand how it's working out there, but how is it understanding in our relationships with our families, in our intimate relationships, in our friendships, when we sit around the dinner table. How does blindness, sameness, silence play there? What are the norms that we're operating that might force us into a stance of collusion, and to really examine that without a judgment, but with a curiosity and a tenderness toward understanding that if you multiply that, and if that becomes a group engagement, the potency that and the contribution that can make toward holding this complex and generational aspect of harm. One way to begin to investigate this within ourselves, and the racial affinity group work that I do, Brave Space, is really an invitation to all races to come together to decolonize or deconstruct mental habits of harm that play in the world, that seed our actions, that are being infused with everything else that we're doing. We might want to investigate what is the fuel in that. Is it hatred? Is it ill will? Is it so urgent that it takes you off center? How aware are we of our impact when we are doing our social activism, the seeds that we're planting? How aligned is it with our vows, as Roshi was saying? So our mindfulness practice helps us settle our nervous system enough to be able to take on this brave investigation of how we've been colonized in our minds and hearts to be in relationship to the global and collective field of harm and healing that's out there. How are we membered in that within our own hearts and families? And coming together as a racial group to investigate whiteness, if you will, to investigate as a Black body of folks coming together to investigate how we've digested internalized oppression, or how we've habituated ourselves around a common enemy that takes us away from our connection with each other, and so on and so forth. So we've all got this racial group identity construction that needs to be examined and tenderized so that our social activism becomes something that is intentionally planting the kind of seeds that nourish us and nourish generations of folks. So there's one exercise in the Brave Space program that I offer to white folks in particular, to begin to step into more intimacy with racial conditioning, and it's called the Untold. It's a reflection exercise first, and then it becomes a writing exercise, and then it becomes something that you share with people that are close to you, people that you love. So I'd like to read that to you as a reflection before we open the group up to Q&A. And while I read it, I want you to keep 50% of your attention on what I'm saying, but also 50% of your attention on your body and breath to kind of notice what you're experiencing as I read it, to bring a certain kind awareness to what's arising, and so on. So I want you to imagine telling your children, regardless of their age, some version of the following story. And this is to white folks in particular. My child, I'd like to tell you from my lips the truth about our racial history, about whiteness, and about being a member of the white tribe. Years ago, our ancestors did a horrific deed against the human race. They owned Black people as slaves and treated them with utter disrespect. Beatings, rape, torture, lynching, ongoing terror. We sold their children to the highest bidder and owned them as chattel. And we relied on them to grow our food and take care of our children, your ancestors. Yes, our people did this, white people. Not only did we do this to Blacks, we also did hateful things to people who we felt were substandard, like indigenous people, Mexicans, Jews, Japanese, Chinese, and poorer people than we were. It's true that the greatness of this country to a large extent is due to the slave labor of Blacks, and we owe them a huge debt. We have, as a white race, disenfranchised them and systemically organized to keep them from participating in and benefiting from the wealthiest country in the world. Our success, however big or small, and the many privileges we enjoy as a family are rooted in this stained and denied history. Even to this day, our people benefit from the institutional practices that intentionally and systemically oppress Black and other dark bodies. Many poor white people feel that we are better than Black people, even better than the first Black president of the United States. Being ashamed about this is not as helpful as understanding that we have a lot of work to do to begin to respect Black and dark bodies, to release and share the wealth and privilege we have for all they have given us as white people. Blacks and other people of color are rightfully angry toward us because of the centuries of hatred and disrespect we have shown them. We have continued as a collective to build prisons to hide and erase them, instead of facing the years of hatred toward them and shame toward ourselves that have resulted in destroying hearts, minds, and communities. Most important, we have died inside as a result of making hatred normal as a white race. We have become numb, dismembered, crude, and unloving toward our own race because we cannot access the depth of love as a collective with such a stained and unfinished and unhealed history of disrespect and hatred toward others. What this means to you and me is that we must wake up to this history and own that we walk with great ease in this country on their still sore backs. Backs we whipped into submission. What we witness today in the Black collective expression is a result of generations of Blacks who have witnessed their parents and grandparents killed, lynched, raped by our men, and hated and disrespected by us. They were helpless against it. We made sure of that. You need to understand, my child, that while we have other fears, we tend to walk without racial fear, and they don't. This world is not safe for them and other people like them, dark people. And it is because of our history, our whiteness, our supremacy. To this day, we have better schools and access, and we are still the central race in all aspects of respectable society, work, and leadership. Black communities are largely poor, and their schools are disenfranchised because we have kept them at a disadvantage. Many Blacks are considered criminals, even though they are not doing anything more than we do, in our communities, yet they are imprisoned and used again as slave labor. Many whites want to maintain white supremacy, and there continues to be white nationalist rallies and terror attacks on other races near and far, currently emboldened by senior members of the White House. We have done horrible things as a white race, unspeakable things, yet we have not spoken or been honest with each other or ourselves as a white race. While you and I may not have done these things personally, this is our history and our inheritance. Our challenge is to do everything humanly possible to recognize and interrupt any act of disrespect and unearned privilege, and to use our voices, our bodies, and our hearts to make this wrong right. We need this in order to be free. This does not mean kissing up to Black folks or anyone else, although it may seem that way. Rather, it means a willingness to face into the pain they carry, because we've been so cavalier, numb, and blind to the role we have played in the past and present horrors of their lives. Our job now, my child, and for a long time, is to own up to it, apologize, and recognize that their expressed pain is not directed to you or me as an individual, but to us as a white race and as the institutional powers that continue to oppress them, often through our ignorance, greed, comfort, righteousness, and indifference. I tell you this because you will receive much disdain from Black people. When they see you, they are also seeing our unclaimed and terrorizing history. They see you as someone who, like our forefathers, hated them. And they see our ignorance, the way we casually delight in the disowned and forgotten history, a history where we considered them as less than human, as possessions, as chattel. This history wasn't that long ago. They are and should be hurt and angry by our utter neglect and generational hatred. There is much to be done. There is no time for guilt and shame. We must forgive ourselves and correct this wrong. We must become advocates for all of humanity, especially Black and dark-skinned bodies. Enough for now, my child, but we will speak again of this, again and again and again. So I invite you to just take a breath. Just notice what you're experiencing. You can ask your body and your heart about that. And, you might consider what comes up for you as you consider telling your child, telling a dear family member such a story that you write, that's your experience, that's coming from your heart. What would that be like for you to write and share? And if you're feeling uneasy or queasy or have an aversion to kind of verbalizing such a story, this becomes the fertile ground for our practice. What gets in the way of that? Can notice what impulses and images come to mind, and what emotions arise for you. And if this untold version of a story feels too far-fetched for you, how do you make it real for you, closer to you? I'd like all of you, each of you, to consider personalizing a story that reflects the truth of your individual experience as a racial being while acknowledging your membership in your racial group. identity. Not being able to speak about racial truths in your own words is one way that white supremacy is upheld and privilege is maintained. Again, racism is a heart disease and it's curable. And when I say heart disease, I mean it's intimate and we want to make it intimate. And one way to make it intimate is to look at how it plays close in our relational field. And this willingness, this courage to investigate and vocalize what's important around this issue to dear ones is a potent form of ripening that seeds the kind of flourishing of our vows that we want to see in this generation and future generations. So I think we can break this cycle, come out of hiding, and touch our belonging in a very intimate way through a deep clarifying and purification of our racial conditioning that is saturated in our vows and our good intentions. I really appreciate your attention and will now turn it over to a Q&A for us.